Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Music Den. I'm your host Armando Venditti, and I'm hoping you guys are having a fantastic night. Um, in this episode of the Music Den, I'm going to be doing another installment of Impact, albums that change music. Now, in trying to pick an artist to talk about, there are many artists that you could pick in modern rock history. Um, it doesn't sound right, does it? And there are many artists that you can pick in the rock genre. That sounds better. That you can talk about in terms of albums that they released that influenced uh, up and coming musicians, even established artists. You can talk about the Beatles, you could talk about the Who, you could talk about the Rolling Stones, you could talk about Queen, you can talk about Led Zeppelin. Those are usually the go-tos. But from my choice, I wanted to talk about an artist, a band that influenced modern day musicians. And that artist is Van Halen and their debut. Now, Van Halen, hailing from Pasadena, California, consisted of, in the original incarnation, Eddie Van Halen on guitars, various instruments, backing vocals, Alex Van Halen on drums and percussion, Michael Anthony on bass, backing vocals, and Dave Lee Roth on lead vocals. Now, they have been together since 1974, playing in local clubs, getting a name for themselves, and building up a reputation for their stage act. They were spotted by none other than Gene Simmons, who really wanted to work with them, and also tried to convince Paul Stanley to work with them, to develop them, and possibly produce some music for them. Stanley, and Bill O'Coin passed on the opportunity because they believed that Kiss should be first and foremost in their efforts and in their day-to-day business affairs. Gene Simmons did finance a three-track demo for the band. Eddie Van Halen was not convinced that this three-track demo would garner any attention. Gene Simmons had to go on tour with Kiss, so he had promised that when he had come back from tour, he was going to secure them a record deal. Casablanca passed on the act. They subsequently signed a deal with Warner Brothers Records and were assigned Ted Templeman as their producer. They produced their debut album. It came out on February 10th, 1978, peaking at number 19 on the US charts, number 18 on the Canadian charts, number 34 in the UK, and number 17 in Australia. And right from the get-go, this album, when it was released, was a game changer. First and foremost, Eddie Van Halen was a virtuoso guitar player. His inspiration, as I heard him saying in one interview as far back as 1995, which really sounds odd for me to say that phrase, was Eric Clapton. He said that Eric Clapton was the one guitarist that really touched him, that really moved him, and that he would spend most nights on his bed practicing guitar. Alex would go out on dates. He'd come back at 1 o'clock in the morning, and Eddie would still be there. Eddie would still be there playing his guitar. Again, when the debut came out, it made an impact. There were bands that were releasing albums at the time, like Sabbath with Never Say Die, Led Zeppelin with Presence, Boston with the debut, even Queen were releasing an album a year. So you had established bands that were releasing albums, but nothing made an impact as this album did. First and foremost, the first 4 tracks on the album: Running with the Devil, Eruption, the wonderful, innovative instrumental from Eddie Van Halen, the lead-off single, You Really Got Me, the cover of the Kings track, and Ain't Talking About Love. Side 1 ends off with I'm the One. Okay? Those 4 tracks on side 1 made a hell of an impression. First and foremost, Eddie Van Halen incorporated a style of playing that incorporated finger tapping, two-handed finger tapping on the fretboard. He played with such veracity and such clean lines. His guitar tone was a really thick, textured sound. Not very clean, but that was, and okay, this is my opinion, but that was what the beauty of it was. It's like it had a really fat, rich, thick sound and very unmistakable sound. Side 2 started off with Janie's Crying. Atomic Punk was another one. Feel Your Love. Little Dreamer. Every song on this album was a balls to the wall, heavy-handed, unrelenting rocker, with the exception of Ice Cream Man, which was a blues cover that they did. The album ends with On Fire. Now, along with Eddie Van Halen's guitar prowess and his virtuosity, you had David Lee Roth and his vocal attack. There wasn't anyone like him at the time in terms of his vocal dexterity, his ability to do the high-pitched screams and shrieks, especially on Fire. Really over the top. And combining his vocals with Eddie Van Halen's and Michael Anthony's, amazing approach, and just fantastic musicianship. It's got to be said. When this album came out, it scared a lot of musicians. Okay, like for example, they went on tour with Black Sabbath in Europe and part of the States for this album. And Black Sabbath and Van Halen were label mates at Warner Brothers. And again, Black Sabbath, this was at a point where the band were getting tired. The albums were not selling as well. They had Technical Ecstasy that came out in 76, and Never Say Die in 78. Both albums sold basically on the strength of being a Black Sabbath album, but musically, they weren't as strong as their previous albums. This album, because of the songwriting craft of Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth and Alex Van Halen and Michael Anthony, scared a lot of people. It was almost like there was like a new sheriff in town, and they were taking over the town. There were record companies and management companies that were trying to sign artists that sounded like Van Halen. They couldn't. There was no way they could. Nobody sounded like Van Halen at this point. And for me, listening to the album, this was David Lee Roth's finest hour with the band. after this point, with the albums that came after this, like Van Halen 2 and Fair Warning, he took on the persona of Diamond Dave, hey, Mr. Showbiz. And again, at least that's my opinion. And I really don't think he was taken seriously in the eyes of the music press. I mean, yes, David Lee Roth had charisma, had the voice, had the stage presence. But I think that this album is the one album that he is taken, in my opinion, taken seriously as a vocalist. Artists that were influenced by Eddie Van Halen and this album include, Nuno Bettencourt from Extreme, Joe Satriani, Yngwie Malmsteen, Eric Johnson, even established artists like Brian May, who looked at Eddie Van Halen as a virtuoso guitar player and fantastic talent. Prior to the release of this album, Ted Templeman tapped Eddie Van Halen to provide guitar parts, uncredited, of course, on Nicolette Larson's debut album, which I do believe came out on Warner Brothers. So he was already becoming known for his guitar virtuosity prior to the release of this album. And this album is looked at by people as the ultimate in a hard rock debut album. The album has achieved diamond status in the US, selling 10 million copies. This one, and I believe 1984, has achieved the same status. So for a debut album over time to achieve diamond status in the US, something is up. Okay. This isn't just smoke and mirrors. This is a band that had the chops, and right from the gate, right from the get-go, pardon me, guys, they proved that they had what it took to get the job done and reach the audience. Okay. They had gone through many different, 3 incarnations, as I stated in my previous video, with Sammy Hagar and Gary Sharon for Van Halen 3. But to most people, this initial incarnation of Van Halen is Van Halen. Do I think that that this is their best album with the David Lee Roth lineup? Yes, unmistakably. I mean, again, every song is a balls to the wall work of art, with the exception of, again, Ice Cream Man, that's a blues cover. And there's swagger, there's sex, there's attitude on every single track, and it's unmistakable. So please check this album out. If you've been living in a cave for the last 40 years and have not heard of it, check out Van Halen and let me know what you think. Put your comments down there. You can listen to the album on YouTube. You can stream it, obviously. And please, again, let me know what you think. Put your comments down there and let me know what you think of Van Halen. Do you like other albums in their catalog from the David Lee Roth era? Are you a Sammy Hagar fan? Do you happen to be one of those few people that love Van Halen 3? Let me know what you think. Also, click like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for any other content that I've got coming up. I've got videos that I'm going to be doing with Peter Kent this weekend. We're going to be doing a discussion on Kiss Harder Than Hell. I'm going to be doing 2 videos coming up with Bill Schuster, Steely Dan album ranking, and the long-awaited Pink Floyd album ranking. So please stay tuned for that. Again, let me know what you think of this album. And for now, I will say good night. Please take care of yourselves and one another, and I will see you very soon. Bye for now.